we're going to go ahead and implement that environment. It's going to be, again, I keep making these typo errors. PHP declare strict types 1 namespace. I mean Magma DataMapper, and the class is going to be DataMapper environment configuration. So this method, as I'm saying, this is going to be where we configure our database connection, which is going to be coming from our application. So we go into a property that's going to be an array, and it's going to be a private array, and it's going to be credentials. I'm going to set that to an empty array. I'm going to give this class a constructor method, which is going to take that argument, or contains one argument, which is going to be array, and that's going to be the credentials, and again it's just going to return void public function construct. I'm going to pipe this property credentials to the constructor argument, which is going to be credentials. I'm going to declare it as an array credentials. Now I'm going to create a method that says a public method, and I'm going to name it get database credentials, right? And this is going to take a driver, a database driver, and it's going to return an array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to call it connection array, and I'm going to set it as an empty array. And because our credential property up here is an array, we can iterate over it. So I'm going to say for each this credential as credential, and I want to actually give you an example of what I'm actually doing. So I'm going to create two files so I can give you an example of what I'm trying to do right here. So I'm going to create within this data map, I'm going to create a YAML file. So let's call it test.yaml, and I'm going to show you what sort of like configuration and how we laid out our configuration, so I can actually show you with examples. So I'm going to say driver and MySQL DSN, and that could be MySQL host equal to localhost for now. Let's leave it at that for now. And I'm gonna say username test password 1 2 3 4. I'm gonna say PG SQL DSN. Again, I'm gonna say PG SQL host equal localhost username to test and password is 1 2 3 4. So this is what YAML configuration look like, and have a look at that. So we got an array which contains some key value pair. Same for So we got an array that contains key value pair. We've got two arrays within this driver array, which contains key value pair. So I will look at that. That's the YAML configuration, and I'm going to show you the PHP equivalent to what we've just did. So the PHP equivalent to that would be driver an array. We got MySQL that contains a next set of array. I'm gonna say DSN would be MySQL host equal localhost, and username equal test, password equal 1 2 3 4, and comma, so PGSQL DSN, say PGSQL host equal localhost, username password. Now, this is the PHP equivalent to what we've just written within this YAML. So you can see that the syntax is much more clean, much more straightforward, and that's why I'm choosing to use YAML to do my configuration. But what I was really showing you is how we're going to write out this method. So what I'm doing right here, I'm looping over this array, and I'm saying if credentials for each this credential as credential, and say if array key exists, driver, which is the driver within the method, the argument, we're going to say credential. So effectively what I'm doing right here, I'm saying we can specify the driver that we want. So if we put MySQL within this argument, we're going to get this array returned back to us. Yeah, so that's what we're doing. We're checking if a driver exists that we support, and if it does, return this array. So we're going to store that array within this variable that we've created earlier on, which is connection array. I'm going to say credential and return the credential for the driver that we specified, and then we just want to return that connection array, just like that. So I was just quickly showing you the equivalent of what we're doing right here, but this is how we're going to go about writing our configuration within this YAML based file. As I'm saying, this was just an example, so I don't actually need that, so I'm going to delete it. It was just to show you what I'm doing. I'm going to delete this as well. So I actually want to go ahead within this method and check for some errors. So I'm going to create a next function and call it, actually make this a private function because it's only going to be used within this class. So is credential valid? So I'm going to use some exceptions to check that we've got the credential that is required. So I'm going to say if empty driver, so I need to specify the driver name, and this is going to be a string. It's going to be driver. So if empty driver and it's not a string, then I'm going to actually throw DataMapper invalid. Again, argument invalid argument exception, and I'm going to pass an argument in, or a message in, that says invalid argument this is either missing, or of the invalid data type. I mean, this is just generic message that I'm putting out. We could modify these later on when we come to actually testing it and play around with how we want to display these stuff or what we want to display. The next one I'm going to say is array, because if it's not an array, then it's not valid. So say this credentials, and throw new DataMapper invalid argument exception. Yeah. And I'm just gonna say invalid credentials for now. And the last one that I wanna throw is if is not in array driver array keys, this credentials driver needs to be driver, then we're going to throw a next. Let's just copy and paste this because this keyboard is really driving me up. DataMapper invalid argument exception, and we're going to put for this is invalid or unsupported driver, unsupported database driver. So obviously we've not yet created this exception class, which is what we can go and create now. So I'm going to copy the name, I'm going to say a new file and paste that in .php, open that, let's create that. So declare strict types one namespace DataMapper, no sorry, to go magma DataMapper exception, and just say class, paste that in again, and this time we're going to extend a different SPL, and that's going to be invalid argument exception. And PHP's got a lot of different exception that we can use based on the context that we're trying to throw that exception in, and I think invalid argument fits this use case. So I'm going to bring that in. So I'm going to be use invalid argument exception. That's it for now. We might come back later on and put a constructor in, a constructor method in, and allow message to be passed around differently on different codes and stuff like that. But we're going to leave it like that for now, and if we need to, we will come back to it later on. But now that we've used that DataMapper invalid argument exception, let's bring it into our class that we require it in. It'll be magma DataMapper exception DataMapper invalid argument exception. So that's effectively our DataMapper environment. Its only purpose is to bring in that credentials. We're going to check it that it's valid, and then return that to our factory when we come to create our factory. So all this is doing is get the user define database connection array, and that's require one param, which is a string, which is a driver, and it returns an array. And again, this just return void because it's not actually got a return type. I want to check in to see that we've got valid data. And checks credentials for validity. Yeah, something generic like that. And again, param, one argument, which is a string, and that's the driver. And we just return in void. So that's effectively our DataMapper environment configuration, and you're gonna see how we hook this up later on. But for now, that is it for this particular class. And what else have we got? So we've got the exception that we've created. We've got DataMapper exception. We've got our DataMapper method. Now I think it's time to look at creating our factory. And a factory pattern is quite popular. You will see it in all the modern frameworks like Laravel, Symfony, and all the other ones that you will find out there. And my use case for a factory is pretty simple. My factory only do one stuff, and that is it creates an object. It creates a single object. And the DataMapper factory is only creating or instantiating the DataMapper class. And that is all it's doing. So I'm going to say PHP declare strict types. I'm not getting this in my drop down. I don't know why. I have to type it out all the time. Strict types equal 1 namespace capital M magma DataMapper. In class going to be DataMapper factory. And I'm going to actually put a constructor method in, but I'm not going to actually do anything in it just yet. So I'm going to say public function construct. Say main constructor. Again, just return void, as it's doing nothing at the minute. But the one actual method that you're going to find in all of my factory classes is a method that is called create. Say public function create. And for this particular factory, there's a couple of arguments that I require for my DataMapper to actually function, and that is the environment and my database object. So I'm going to do something like this. I'm going to say string, it's a database connection object. Yeah, I could say that. And it'll be a string. It's going to be data mapper environment configuration. I know these are long argument names, but I'm trying to be explicit. I'm trying to be explicit in how I'm naming it. And yeah, so this is actually going to return the DataMapper interface. Yeah. So the first thing I want to tackle within this method is the DataMapper environment configuration. It's a very long name. So I'm going to actually say create a new variable called credential, because that's what we're trying to get. We're trying to get the credentials. I'm going to say credentials equal, and I'm going to wrap this into parentheses. I'm going to say new DataMapper environment configuration parentheses. So we're sort of like instantiating whatever DataMapper environment we put into this argument, when we come to gel everything together. So we're going to say a new DataMapper environment configuration, and it's going to be the constructor of that class. And this is the class, by the way, and we're going to be trying to call the get database credentials, and hence the reason why we've wrapped it in parentheses. Then we can do something like this, like a chaining. So we're going to say get database credentials all on one line. Yeah, so we know from this class that our constructor require an array for the argument, and the get database credential require a string as an argument. But obviously we've not yet created those YAML configuration files, so we can hard code it for now. So we're going to say MySQL, and we're just going to say put an array. We're going to say driver. No, I'm going to say MySQL. Call another array. I'm going to say DSN equal MySQL host localhost, etc. Just an example. So it's just an example that I'm showing you right here, but this is what it would be expecting if we had that configuration ready. But again, let's just take this out. It looks a bit silly. Just gonna leave an empty array in there for now, just so we're returning something, because this constructor is actually expecting a argument, and it's not optional, it's a required argument, hence why we've not put that onto it. So back into our factory. So let's pretend that we've got all of our credentials, and let's jump to the next bit of our code, which is going to be our database. Actually, let's refactor this 1 minute. Let's say database connection object, and let's change that from object to a string, because that's what we're going to be passing in, a string that reference our database connection class. So we're going to say database connection object equal new database connection string parentheses, and we're going to pass that credentials in. And if I take you back to our database connection class, it's what we're actually referring to, and you notice that in the constructor it requires that credentials, which is what we're passing in right here, that credentials that we need to establish a connection. So we're going to say if database object, or object not string, object is not an instance of or database connection interface, then we're going to throw a DataMapper exception. I was trying to look for the right exception to under this particular scenario, but I couldn't actually find one that fits. So I'm going to just return that default exception. Are we going to say database connection string is not a valid database connection interface, or database connection object? So what we effectively doing is, if our database connection class does not implement that database connection interface, we're just going to kick you out because you're not valid. You're not following the rules. Right? That's as simple as what we're doing right here. Just kicking you out if you've not implemented that interface. And that goes as well if we're extending this or redoing this database connection externally and implement it within our framework. We have to implement that interface, or else we're just not going to let you in. So I'm saying return new DataMapper, and look at our DataMapper class, and you can see that we've got a constructor that requires that database connection. So I'm going to pass in that database connection object. So it's going to be database connection object. And you can see already how we linking our factory class as linked our data mapper to our database connection. And that's as simple as it gets for this factory pattern that we're going to be using within our data mapper. I mean, we're going to be implementing different factories in different part of this ORM, but this is the completed part for this actual part of the project. So that is it for this factory. So we're going to close that out. I'm going to look at what we've got so far. Let's close this out as well. So this is just the first part of our ORM. Our ORM consists of different components, but this is just the first component, which is the data mapping component. And we got a data mapper, which is basically wrapping around PDO's own method that allows us to use this method within our framework, because as I was saying earlier, I want to keep PDO central. I want to keep it in one place, so if we need to make changes, I mean, it's pretty unlikely that PDO and its method are going to change. It's very unlikely, but I want to keep it, well, I think for me it's good practice that I keep it in one place, and if there was ever any changes, I have only got that one place to make that change. And that's the idea behind why I've created this data mapping class, to keep PDO in one place, so I can then use my own method that wraps around those PDO method. I can then use them throughout my framework. So we've got our environment, which takes the credential and pass it to the factory, so we can then pass that back to our database connection object. And that's the interface. Again, we'll be adding to this as we go along, improving it, fine-tuning it, probably just jig it about, but again, we're going to be doing all of that together.